Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 148, Grinding Down Our Golden Calf. And in this episode, what I would like to do is to bring together several of the things we've been looking at over the past few episodes and begin looking directly at some issues and some belief systems that have pretty powerfully gripped the evangelical church in modern day America, and the way that I think some of those issues and beliefs lean a little bit more toward a power over form of Christianity than many people would like to admit. And so what I really want to do is pull the veil back, not attack anything, but address some of the issues and places where we may have gone wrong, and to identify maybe a more Christian way to think about some of these topics. Again, I'm going to share simply my perspective. You are free to agree or disagree as usual on this podcast. But my wife helped me come up with the title, and I really like it. And so there will be several parts to this little series, Grinding Down Our Golden Calf. This is just the first one of them. And I decided to address one of the topics, politically speaking, that is probably the biggest one, and that is the abortion discussion. And with the recent events of the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, I thought it might be good for us just to think about this in the way our culture has taught us or encouraged us to think about the issue of abortion and what the Bible actually might say about it, especially as it relates to the idolatry committed in Exodus 32. And so I have a few thoughts about what I think might help us here, and I just want to share them with you. So let's get right into it. To begin this week's episode, allow me just to read from Exodus chapter 32, verses 19 and 20. And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Now it's from verse 20 that we got the title for this episode, and that is when Moses ground the golden calf into powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people of Israel drink it. I think the image that's really helpful for us here is that what was for the people an expression of such joy and such a thrill for them, Moses, of course, by burning this golden calf, scattering it on the water, making the people of Israel drink it, it's like taking into themselves something that isn't quite as desirable as it once was on the outside. And I think that there's a lot in the Bible about this, is expressing things in one way externally, and then the way we experience them in a different way is a very different experience. And so I like the image. I think it's a good one. As I shared several episodes ago, anytime the kings all throughout the Old Testament were commended or critiqued, it was always based upon what they did with the idols that were currently in the land and whether or not they tore them down or whether they allowed them to remain. And of course, as the king himself was supposed to be the embodiment of the image of God, how that king thought about his job as a ruler, what he thought it meant to have authority, communicated a lot to the people. And this is always the case, especially the case, as I've said, with political matters. What we are questioning is, what do we want those in authority over us? How do we want them to go about exercising that authority and exercising that rule? And this really is a reflection of the way we think God exercises his rule. And so while political matters aren't always Christian or not Christian, the way we think our politicians are there to make laws or enforce their authority on the rest of the nation tells us actually a little bit about the way we think God might do that in his own interactions with us. Of course, it's no news to you, right? But politicians actually just sell policies in order to buy people. And I do think that that is actually true. I think that's true on both sides of the political aisle, so don't mishear me when you're listening to this episode. But I think that that's just a funny way to put it, but a very helpful way to put it. And that is that politicians sell policies in order to buy people. And I'm just going to share again what I think about this topic. I am actually in discussions with some people in the real world, right? Not just in podcast land, but in the real world who have very different views than me on this particular topic. And so I've had a lot of time to think about this and listen to the other side and come up with ways that I want to communicate what's true and also work very, very hard to maintain relationship with people that I don't agree with. And it's a hard thing to do. I'll just be really honest with you. This seems very clear and easy to understand to me, but I have a lot of different ways of thinking about the kingdom of God or thinking about Christianity's impact or influence rather, or even the way that it relates with American culture as a whole. And for whatever reason, we get into these discussions, and I tend to think that sometimes Christians allow the partisan political talking points to become their talking points. And I do know that within the Republican Party, those talking points are wed very closely to certain interpretations of the Bible. And I know that that's what makes it very hard for Christians to listen to a different opinion and not think that it's just automatically an unbiblical opinion. And so what I want to do is I don't want to talk about the extremes here. I don't want to talk about the far left or the far right. I don't want to talk about the radical left or the radical right. I'm not here to claim that any person who has an opinion on this matter is perfectly, that their opinion is the exact same as anybody else's opinion. I'm here to share with you some thoughts I have about the way this discussion, right? We're talking about real lives here, both unborn babies as well as women who are pregnant with these babies. And I don't want us to forget that this conversation is not a talking point. This is not an issue. This is not something to be debated. These are real people living in the real world, dealing with real struggles. And I want to say right off the bat that I'm well aware of the fact that as a man, I will never be in the position where I am facing an unwanted pregnancy inside my own body. And so I will say what I'm going to say with an understanding that this isn't directly talking to me. And I'm aware of that when I approach this discussion. So as heated as arguments oftentimes get in these discussions, I do not want us to forget that real people are those who are potentially suffering, who are scared, who are excited, who are going through a whole range of emotions. And the way we talk about this, I think, is really, really important. And so really what I want to do is I just want us to think a little bit about the way this is typically framed. I grew up with the idea that from several of the Psalms and from promises that God is the author of life and as the creator of life, that anyone who would seek to take away the life of someone that God has created is clearly transgressing God's laws, and any Christian would want laws to be put in place to protect the lives of the unborn. And so what typically happens from a conservative standpoint is that the radical left is brought forward as people who are eager to celebrate the mass murder of unborn babies and who are celebrating that there are no restrictions or no reason why they should not just give full vent to their evil. And it's frustrating a little bit because the flip side of this is that someone on the Democratic side or the liberal side, right, as we talked about in last week's episode, will say that all a conservative wants to do is to control a woman's body, to tell her what she will do with her own life, and it is the woman's choice as as a free and autonomous individual, it is entirely her choice what she chooses to do with her body. And then the argument, I think, sadly, has gone into the direction of debating whether or not an unborn fetus is actually a living being, or whether there's a period of time at which, when does life begin? Does life begin at conception, or does life begin at birth? And based upon your biological bent and the way you want to interpret passages of Scripture, getting into this topic gets really messy really fast, and people end up arguing over this point. Let me just bring it to light what I believe personally. I do believe that life begins at conception. I do believe that God himself is the author of life. I believe that God is very carefully and very lovingly nurtures infants in the mother's womb. I believe that God is the author of life. He's the giver of life, and he's the sustainer of life. Where I land when I come to this discussion, and sadly, people who listen to me think that I can only possibly land in one of two camps, is that I don't actually see life itself working out in such black and white terms. This is one of the main reasons why I push back on some of the opinions that are given by various political parties, because they want to isolate this as a black and white issue when it is not in a black and white world. So some would say, as the liberals might say, you don't have the right to control what I do with my body. Like, get your hands off my body or whatever. And I think that that's a fair statement. And then I've heard conservatives push back and say, well, when we are protecting the lives of the unborn, we are speaking for the babies who can't speak, who might also be saying, get your hands off my body. And I think that there's some validity to both perspectives. And I think both perspectives need to be constantly kept in tension, recognizing that we are attempting now to care for the unborn, who I do believe are a vulnerable part of our society. But the part where I tend to disagree a little with the way the conservative liberals frame the question is that I also put the women who are pregnant into the category of the vulnerable people of our society. Now, I know the church I grew up in didn't do this. Women were actually not treated with a lot of dignity and a lot of respect, especially as it centered around issues of sexuality or pornography or modesty, things like this in our church. It was almost always, if a guy is struggling with lust, it's because a woman, maybe even someone in his own church, was dressed inappropriately, and therefore the solution to man's lust problem is to get women to cover up, wear more clothes, don't wear spaghetti straps on your shirts. I grew up in the purity culture. If a boyfriend and girlfriend have sex and get pregnant, somehow it was the girl's fault because he has a higher sex drive than she does. And if the two of them had sex, it's because she didn't, step in and put up these boundaries that were going to protect this, poor helpless man who couldn't control his sexual urges. And it very much became a culture of women were the problem. Women were the ones who tripped men up. Men would have otherwise been perfectly healthy and perfectly direction, having a life of direction if it weren't for the women. And so the way this topic is often brought up is it's super unfortunate, but the reality is this is not an issue that affects men. This is an issue that affects women. Women biologically are the ones who can get pregnant. And so by nature, this discussion is once again about women. And it's very frustrating to me when I look at the way it's discussed and men are not held to the same account or held to the same standards or given the same level of expectation as women are. And so a black and white situation of, because God's the author of life, therefore you should do X, Y, Z with your pregnancy, does, in my opinion, border on the power over idea of the Christian faith. We are here to tell people what they will and will not do with their body and our moral stances. And because we believe that our morals are correct and that they come from God, we believe that it's a non-arguable position. And you don't have to listen long to the news to find out that that's exactly the way that conservative liberals frame this. It's a non-arguable position. You either love human life or you're a devil worshiper. who just wants to murder people for no reason. I'm sorry, but that's not real life. And shortly after the Roe versus Wade decision came out, there was a case of a 10-year-old girl in Indiana who had been raped. Now, I can't even begin to understand, much less enter into the unbelievable trauma centering around a rape and what that girl had gone through, is currently going through, and will continue to go through for decades of her life. Rape is a violent act. It's a senseless act. And it is an unbelievably traumatic event to have experienced. To then enter into that situation with our black and white view of God is the author of life, therefore you can't abort this child, is not only uncaring, but it is absolutely steamrolling the fact that this is a real girl in the real world with real concerns. Not the least of which would be the trauma of being raped by a person and then knowing or trying to come to know as a very young child that the baby in your womb came from this rapist. She's already probably having nightmares about this event. What on earth would this do for the duration of her life? This is the trouble I personally feel, and why you've heard me mention John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery, numerous times. It's a woman who's brought to Jesus who is caught in the act of adultery. And what I want to say when I read that story is, if she was caught in the act of adultery, then where is the man? The fact is, he's not there. And the Pharisees know this. But they look at this woman as just an object of someone to find out for Jesus whether Jesus is going to uphold the law of Moses or not. Is Jesus going to realize that marriage is sacred, and isn't Jesus going to blast this woman for not honoring the institution of marriage which he set up? And they're looking for the wrong kind of conclusion. They might say it's out of respect for marriage, but marriage is nothing more than the union of two people in the real world who are making life better for one another by being married and are going to care for and nurture a family through that marriage. But those kinds of attitudes certainly don't come from having one person dragged through the mud and not the other. And so I unfortunately, the way this is often talked about today with abortion is that it's a women's thing. And once again, it's men deciding for women what they will and won't do with their body. And I have to give credence to that. It doesn't mean that I don't care also for the baby. I would view the Christian position as one who works its tail off to both honor the fears, concerns, traumas, anxieties of the woman, as well as doing everything in our power to not only love, accept, embrace, and welcome and provide for her, but also to nurture and to care for and to introduce options for her that would be best for her unborn baby. That's a conversation and a reality that takes place in relationship, not in policy making. And it doesn't mean that policy can't be helpful or useful, but what it does mean is that if we put all of our eggs in the basket of policy and we fight and we fight and we fight just to make abortion illegal, instead of fighting to potentially, make it unnecessary, then we will fall prey to the idea of thinking that God is really most primarily interested in having all the right laws in place. But when people flounder under those laws, where's the sense of compassion and mercy? How does it manifest itself? What does it look like? What should it look like? This is what I want us to talk about. Because I honestly think, and I've got a couple examples of some things that I would like to just talk my way through, but I want to start by just pointing out, as a conversation I had with Tim Gombis several months ago, and he really put it in these words, and I kind of went back later and typed out more or less what he said, but basically our conversation centered around this. Both sides, the conservative liberals and the liberal liberals, can agree that abortion is undesirable. It's an undesirable outcome. It's not something that is going to better the life of the child, obviously. And it is also not something that is going to better the life of the woman. She'll go through her own trauma through an abortion. It's an undesirable outcome. The issue, though, surrounds competing views of what will reduce the number of abortions. This is a question that is not communicated from the conservative liberal side. They don't open the door for the possibility that there might be other ways than simply outlawing something for you to reduce the number of abortions. And I'm getting in a conversation right now and am being accused of that if I don't agree with somebody's one way of going about solving this problem, then I am not being faithful or I am not being biblical. And I do want to point out, and I'll point out to you as listeners here, that in a fallen world, which is where we live, there are an infinite number of ways that someone might go about fixing brokenness. All right? If you go to a doctor, he's going to give you a particular mode of treatment, right? Because something has gone wrong. And if you don't like that treatment option, you're going to seek another opinion. And you might get a different opinion from a different doctor who's going to say, you know what? That first approach, it probably would work. It's way too invasive. Your body's going to have a very hard time recovering from that. I think there's a much simpler process involved. And I say we do this. The recovery will be quicker. It is a safer procedure. You'll spend less time in the hospital. And I believe ultimately you're going to find yourself in the same place as the other procedure, only without all of the extra work. You as a person are free to choose which one of those you want. You both want to be healed from your problem, and you both are going to an expert to help you do it. But one is going to lay out a different path to get to that same goal than the other person. Well, which path do you pick? It's your choice. You pick whichever path gets you to the proper outcome. And I think that's the same way for us in a fallen world. There are an infinite number of ways that you might think about fixing the problem. Some people start with the truth, and then they relate the truth to their relationships. Some people start with relationship, and then they figure out, how do I bring that relationship with that person into the truth? Both are accurate. Jesus embodies both. But many people in this world, even with simple personality differences, process their information and process their interactions with other people in life in different ways. One is not right and the other is wrong. You have a choice. We are autonomous people too who have a choice. And it doesn't mean that if you disagree with somebody's one way of going about resolving the problem, that you are now deviating from the truth. Maybe together, the two of you can come up with a plan that is better than each one of you had on your own. This is what I want to introduce as Christians talk about this, instead of picking up the terminology that's often thrown around on the news channels and imagining that if somebody doesn't agree with you hook, line, and sinker, and think that the solution to this abortion topic is to simply outlaw it, right? Make it illegal. If you don't agree with that, then somehow you aren't taking life seriously. Well, I've heard the accusation leveled against a conservative liberal that they are pro-birth, they're not pro-life. And I know that the conservative liberals themselves don't like that accusation. They find that to be unfair. And I hear that, and I wouldn't say that to somebody to put them in their place. But what I would say, and pick this up several months ago from an article that I read by a pastor named Ben Cremer. I follow him on Facebook and on Instagram, and he just raised a couple of questions, and I think they're valid, and I want to read some of them to you. He says, imagine what our country would look like today if the pro-life movement spent as much time, money, and power over the last 50 years dismantling systems of poverty as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. Imagine what our country would look like today if the pro-life movement spent as much time, money, and power over the last 50 years demanding universal health care as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. Imagine what our country would look like today if the pro-life movement spent as much time, money, and power over the last 50 years demanding guaranteed family leave as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. Demanding affordable childcare as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. Demanding Christian culture stop shaming and marginalizing women as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. demanding quality reproductive education, as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade, demanding livable wages, as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade, demanding that we advocate for women with the same sacredness, respect, and dignity it demanded we do for the unborn, as it did trying to overturn Roe versus Wade, working to make abortions unnecessary rather than just working to make them illegal. Imagine what our culture would think of how we Christians value life today if that was the path we had taken. Now, I find those questions, and just leave them where they are, to be highly relevant to this topic. Except all of the points that I just read, dismantling systems of poverty, demanding universal health care, demanding guaranteed family leave, demanding affordable childcare, demanding Christian culture stop shaming and marginalizing women, demanding quality reproductive education, demanding livable wages, demanding that we advocate for women with the same sacredness, respect, and dignity it demanded we do for the unborn. Those are not topics that are typically talked about in the Christian circles that I've been a part of. Why? Why has that been the case? Why have we not done that to a greater degree? It seems to me that part of the reason why we haven't done that is because many of those points are oftentimes believed to be for a liberal to discuss. They want systems of poverty to be dismantled, and they're fighting for universal health care or guaranteed family leave. And this is why it's so wrong that we get into the partisan divides, because we talk as if we can't care for women or care for the unborn and care for the women who find themselves in frightening and or potentially vulnerable situations faced with an unwanted or undesirable pregnancy. And in a world where women don't have options, in a world where affording to live and care for a child is like they can't fathom how that could actually happen, we now are looking, and I really love that point by Ben Cremer, working to make abortions unnecessary rather than just working to make them illegal. And I think the unnecessary part is really where I think Christians ought to land. You know, making an abortion illegal declares that a law put in place will prevent you from doing the wrong thing. And if you choose to do the wrong thing anyway, well, then we will punish you somehow for it, or we will find these doctors who are performing abortions illegally, or we will remove doctors' licensing, or we will do all of these various things. When there are real people who are genuinely struggling with what it would look like if I were to keep this baby, or really struggling because of the stigma that's going to be attached to them as a result of something that has now happened to them. And I do need to bring up at this point a point that Ben Cremer also brings up, and I think it's very fitting, and that is to recognize that many of these same kinds of discussions are taking place within our churches. And here's a statistic which you might not have heard of. I was actually a little bit surprised, not from disbelief, but just to really put the numbers down on paper and realize, oh my goodness, this is different than what I had imagined. And that is that 24% of abortion patients identified as Catholic. 17% of abortion patients identified as mainline Protestant, and 13% of abortion patients identified as evangelical Protestant. Now, put simply, the vast majority of abortions, 54%, are happening among women in Christian churches. Imagine how many lives we could save if we obliterated the culture of shaming women within our churches. This is why the way we talk about this as Christians is so important. There are some Christians who believe that they are being absolutely faithful to God by standing on the truth of what God says about the lives of the unborn and how important and valuable they are to Him, which is true, by the way. But they say it and talk about it with such rigor that there might be unaware of the way that truth is landing on people in their very own churches, some of whom, number one, may have already had an abortion, or number two, might be in the early stages of discovering that they're late on their period and they might in fact be pregnant and are being flooded with all sorts of fears and concerns. And the church being the one place in the world where people who are going through troubling times, or who are discouraged, or who are afraid, or who are questioning things, or who are going through traumatic experiences, the church should be the one place where they feel safe enough to come clean with what it is that's going on in their lives. I have an unwanted pregnancy. My boyfriend and I really thought that having sex was going to be the right decision, and now I'm pregnant and we have no idea what we're going to do. This is not the plan that we had in our minds. But guess what? Sometimes the way churches talk about this, these women don't feel comfortable bringing this up in church. And according to the statistics, over half of the people who seek abortions are people who are sitting in the churches where the church claims to be the place where we advocate for the oppressed, or we look after the marginalized. And I'm just going to say, claiming to work for the benefit of the unborn as this marginalized class all by itself, but in the process, or the way you go about doing that, ends up marginalizing and oppressing the women who are going to give birth to these babies, we've got a messed up system. Because nothing in Jesus' kingdom oppresses one group in order to elevate another. Nothing. In fact, everything in Jesus' kingdom elevates everyone. And this is some of the trouble that we found with the golden calf issue. And I read at the beginning of verse 19 that when Moses came down, he saw the calf and he saw the dancing. And it's funny, but the reality is it's exciting. It's invigorating to worship a God, quote unquote, whose power is made manifest when he dismantles oppressive systems. And of course, Israel watched him dismantle an oppressive system. That oppressive system was Egypt. But if we are not careful, we can unknowingly create new systems of oppression by the way we seek to embody God's kingdom. And I would like to submit to you that in part, not wholly, and people don't mean ill by this, and this is not a demon attack against people who are pro-life or pro-birth or whatever some of the accusations are of the conservative liberals. This is simply to point out that sometimes the way we talk, the speech we adopt, the dogmatism with which we hold to our views of truth or our views of what is right, can sometimes unknowingly steamroll people in the real world, creating new systems of oppression and fear where the church becomes the last place that women in their time of need feel comfortable opening up. That is a travesty. Because when you worship God as a power over deity, or imagine that his primary concern is to enact a law that everybody has to abide by, nearly always creates oppression for someone else. It might not be you, but it could be someone. But life in Jesus' kingdom dismantles oppression wherever it's found, even if it's found among God's very own people. And his ways are life-giving for everybody, not just for the people who know and follow him. And so this is really what I see. What I see quite a bit is the idea that basically what's happening is that the church sometimes is an organization that's viewed by those outside the church as this big organization that's just coming to take things from you or to impose their belief system on you and tell you how to live. And that's not what the church is. Even if the church believes that God's ways are good and right and true and best for the world, which I personally believe, the way we go about communicating that to the world means every bit as much as what it is we are communicating. You've heard me say before on this podcast, and I'll say it again, when Jesus called himself the way, the truth, and the life, we need to recognize that the way we present the truth And the life we invite people into when they believe the truth and abide by it is every bit as important as the truth itself. We sometimes say, well, Jesus is the truth, and the truth. And I'm a faithful Christian when I stand on the truth and I make sure that I don't mince words and people know what I believe and they know what God believes and what God says. But Jesus doesn't act that way. He invites people into a new life. And the way in which he does that is through compassion, is through grace, is through acceptance, is through embrace. As I talked a little bit at length last episode about the woman who was caught in adultery from John chapter 8. But one of the things that I see, and I've seen this before, is that the church sometimes gets a little bit twisted views of power and what it means to exercise power or what it means to exercise authority. And we looked at this from Matthew 20 last episode about ruling and not lording it over people like the Gentiles do. But the reality is, in our lives, we see forms of power all the time. If you were to think of a parent and a child, let me walk you through several different forms of power and how a parent might exercise power or authority over their child. The first level is just brute force, right? When this baby is first born, they're just a little baby, like they can't do anything for themselves. So the parent physically picks them up when they're crying. They physically put them over the shoulder to burp them after they are fed. They physically feed them. They physically change them. They physically bathe them. The baby can do nothing. So brute force is a form of power that the one in authority and the one in protection takes care of the one, beneath, right? But when your kid is 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, you can enter into a separate form of power. And power is not just brute force, but it's also, this might be a crass way to put it, but it's kind of like manipulation, right? So you might negotiate with your kid. If you do this thing, if you clean up your toys, then I'll give you this cookie, I'll give you something that you really want. Or if you don't, put your books back on the shelf, then you're not going to be able to have dessert, right? And we make these little negotiations with our kids, like that's a little form of power. We have the power, right? We have the cookies. And we are offering them to the child if they will just do what we ask. And sometimes, you find yourselves in situations in our not so great moments as parents where we end up scheming or we are a little cunning, wheeling and dealing with our kids, thinking of the next best thing. How do I get my kids to do exactly what I want? If you come out of your room one more time after I've put you to bed, you're going to get a spanking, or I'm not going to let you watch your favorite show tomorrow. Like we end up doing things that we look back on later and say, that may not have been the best use of my parental authority, but I didn't know what else to do, and we forgive ourselves as parents because we've all done that. But as our kids get a little bit older, our form of authority may take the realm of expertise, right? Like our kids, they don't know how to ride a bike. And so we're like, well, I know how to ride a bike, so let me teach you. And sometimes if we've got a good open relationship with our kids, they may come to us and be like, Dad, I don't know how to ride a bike. Can you teach me? And I would love to. And I've done that with my kids, and we had a great time with it. I'm still the one in power, right? I have knowledge now that they don't have that I'm sharing with them. But I'm not coercing them, or I'm not manipulating the situation, hopefully. If you don't learn to ride a bike, I'm going to ground you for a month. Like, I hope that's not the way the parent-child relationship is working, when their kids are like 7, 8, 9, whatever. But their kids reach teenage years or even at 7, 8, 9, whatever. But they're looking at us as an example, right? They've watched us do things. Hey, Dad, I've watched you, for so many years, like, just, every time the toilet doesn't work, you fix it. Like, hey, can you show me how to do that? Because I noticed the way you do it, or the way that you handle when we get into a conflict, you're patient, or you just listen to us, can you help me do that? And our kids are always watching, that's a form of power, is our example. But then ultimately as parents, what we're looking for is this place of like wisdom and service. And that is that we get to this place where we say, like, I'm going to be with you no matter what. And I'm going to serve you no matter what. Like, you're my son, you're my daughter. I love you. I always will. The choices you make, I may not love, but I'm going to serve you. I'm going to stand with you in the midst of your brokenness, and I'm going to be there with you. And even if you make a choice that isn't the choice I would choose, or I don't really think it's the best for you, I'm not going to threaten you or cajole you or manipulate you. I'm going to stand there with you in it because I care about you. And I personally think of the incarnation of Jesus as this fifth form of power. It's power in weakness, right? It's Jesus standing with us, not over us. It's Jesus coming to serve under us, not standing over us, lording it over us. Rather, he comes to us in our mess. He meets the woman caught in adultery by writing in the dirt. He meets her alone after all her accusers go away, and Jesus speaks to her with compassion and kindness, and he meets her there. He invites her into a life where she has connection with Almighty God. And from that place, he encourages her to walk away from a life of adultery. Why? Because she's now part of a better life. The life she's now been invited into is better. She's found love from a man, right? And she may not need to go seek it in an adulterous relationship. So that's the ultimate form of power. So it starts with brute force, right? Then it's manipulation. Then it's expertise. I know something you don't know. Let me teach you. It's my example. Here's the way I've lived. I live by my own guidance or my own guidelines. Like, just if you like the life you see me live, you might want to know why I live it this way. And then the final example is wisdom and service. It's bringing together all of the knowledge that I have in order to be able to live a life filled with wisdom, eager to serve, just like Jesus did. But here's what's interesting. The church, historically, so often reaches for the first two powers while appealing to the third. And let me tell you what I mean. We like to use the brute force category, and we do this with what I might call political force. We're willing to manipulate political systems and manipulate people for our own agendas. And this is why it's super unfortunate, right? I said at the beginning, kind of a fun little phrase, but it's just true and sad at the same time. Politicians sell policies in order to buy people. That is absolutely true. And it is very discouraging to me, the number of people I've met who have bought the phrase, well, I'm a single issue voter. Whichever candidate is pro-life in this very narrow sense of the word, that is the candidate who will get my vote. Never mind their economic policies. Never mind their policies on immigration. Never mind their policies on foreign affairs. Never mind their policies on capitalistic society, free market society, anything else that happens to be. I've decided within myself that this one issue, narrowly defined, is the most important issue on the voting block. And any politician who says the words that I want to hear will get my vote. I personally think that Donald Trump's decision to run as a Republican and to pick up that language has just duped thousands and thousands, if not millions of people into ignoring vast portions of him, his very own person, but also other policies and power grabs that he was trying to offer the world through his language of it's the abortion point. We're going to be pro-life, and Donald Trump is the most pro-life president in the history of America. Do you realize, right, that the only time you need people and yourself to say something like, I'm the most pro-life person ever to walk the planet, anytime a person has to say that out loud, it's because they know and everyone around them knows that it isn't true. So anyone who walks with integrity and actually believes something wholeheartedly doesn't have to repeat that mantra over and over in an attempt to convince people of its veracity. That's just not a thing in the real world. And yet that had to be done over and over and over and over and over. Why? Well, because the majority of Donald Trump's very long life, he was a Democrat, not a Republican. And you look at his practices in the world and ask, why is it that he switched in the end? Well, I've read enough articles now to know that why he switched in the end was because he saw a very rather large voting bloc that he knew he could convince to be on his side if he would simply tout for the pro-life portion the way that it's narrowly defined. But regardless, many times the church reaches for the brute force or the manipulation tactic, manipulating political systems or manipulating people for their own agenda, using political force. We will put our kind of people in the positions of power who can change the laws that will make America a place that God's face will shine upon. We need to know that what that actually is political force and it's manipulation. But the rationale Christians give is an appeal to the third form of power. It's expertise. They don't claim, though, that they have the expertise. What they claim is that they know what God has to say on the matter, and because God is the expert on everything, this particular way that a Christian interprets God's words, he now or she now believes they have the right to use political force and political manipulation because God says so. And this is what I've seen happen over and over and over again. A Bible verse will be quoted or it'll be thrown into the mix, and it is a particular interpretation of a Bible passage, which then many Christians decide is a black and white rubber stamp of this is God's view for all time, all situations. It doesn't matter your scenario. It doesn't matter your circumstances. This is God's view. And if you go against it, you are just being unbiblical, unfaithful, ungodly, or all of the above. And I just don't think that's a fair representation of reality, because the church has failed to use itself as an example to follow and then to embody the idea of a people who have learned wisdom and how to be men and women in a community of service. It's almost as if these last two forms of power, the ones where our children, as parents, our children actually begin to have freedom. And our relationship with our kids starts to change, where they start to come to us willingly for advice and for counsel because we've not manipulated them. We've not cajoled them or threatened them. Well, we did when they were little, and we feel bad about it because we realize that's a faulty way to parent. But fortunately, kids are super resilient and they bounce back. And most of our kids, unless they're really intelligent, don't probably remember much of the first few years of their lives. And we'd probably want to forget some of the poor decisions we made in the first few years of their lives anyways. But the point I'm making is that what Jesus has come to do is come to embody the wisdom and service form of power, where he backs up by his example. And what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 11? Follow me as I follow Christ. What does Paul do? He talks about serving the church, just like Jesus took off his outer garment, wrapped it around his waist, and washed the disciples' feet. Jesus is a power under model of service. And what this means for the church is the way that we speak and the way that we posture ourselves in society has to mirror Jesus's posture of power under. It has to look for every conceivable place where there might be someone who is afraid, someone who feels vulnerable, someone who feels taken advantage of, someone who feels hopeless or directionless. And I personally, when I say those words, I personally think of lots of women who find themselves in a place where they weren't prepared to have a baby, or who absolutely love babies and want them to be brought into this world, but can't deny the fact that they're panicking right now over the reality of what this would look like if they actually carried a pregnancy to term. And then I think of people in the church that when I was in the church growing up, had sex with their boyfriend, got pregnant, and then had to be brought in the front of the church to confess to the entire church that they had committed sin. And it was the girl who, of course, when she has sex with a boy, she's the one who gets pregnant. It's her body that's affected, and people know you had sex with somebody you weren't married to because I can see this baby growing in your stomach. Whereas a guy can participate in that same activity and go right on about his life and is not held to any type of an account for the actions that he's committed. And so it's important to me that we begin to think of new ways of talking about this topic that don't continually center around women and people telling them what they will and won't do with their body. Because I do think it's unfortunate that this is the place we found ourselves in. But in this broken world, it's not only which one of the infinite number of ways do we think we need to go about fixing the problem, but it's also recognizing that the world is broken, and what aspects of the broken world are we most attuned to? Because the reality is, if I'm in relationship with a member of my church And he is attuned to the realities of the unborn baby. And I am attuned to the realities of hurting, fearful, hopeless women. Am I here to tell him that he should stop being concerned for what he's concerned about and that he should adopt my concern? Am I a hand and he's a foot? Am I an ear? Is he an eye? Do we not need both parts in order to be a functioning body? The answer is yes. But we get so caught up when we adopt the talking points of the political party. The political party is not a body. It doesn't function like the church. The political parties are mudslinging enemies of each other who don't, well, occasionally we'll find a bipartisan bill which is put forth, which when it really comes down to it, people can see the validity of both sides of these topics. But I don't often wonder if all the bipartisan things aren't really what we should just spend our entire time doing, because instead we tend to argue so violently against one or the other. And so I really do think that for us as Christians, if our definition of truth allows us to sacrifice love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control at the altar of being right when we engage our culture, then it is not the truth of Jesus we are proclaiming. It's ours. And that's a quote from Ben Cremer, who I've been quoting from earlier. Definitely encourage you to find him online. If you don't already follow him, you should, because he has a lot of great things to say. But Jesus doesn't sacrifice the fruit of the Spirit in order to stand on truth. And he does not sacrifice truth in order to stand on the fruit of the Spirit. Jesus perfectly embodies both. And I think right now, in this discussion, as it centers around real people, I want the church to posture itself as the place where we can both state what we believe is best for life and human flourishing, but recognize that the way we talk about that has to take into consideration that people listening to us, even in our own church pews, will be able to receive the truth with the grace and compassion in our tone, that if they find themselves on the wrong side of that, or at a place where they're now carrying additional guilt for a decision they've made, or maybe they don't feel any guilt at all for the decision that they've made, but they want to process through how to think about their life in the right way. We want them to hear the truth in a loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, good, gentle, faithful, and self-controlled type of way. So the way we invite people into the truth and the life we invite them into by the way we speak about the truth is every bit as important as the truth itself. And this is desperately needed in the church, because without it, we are once again being a power over Christian group. We are now adopting this view that because God loves the unborn, that we need to make laws that will force people, even people who don't adhere to our morality, or who don't adhere to belief in God at all, that what the Christian group is primarily concerned about is about us forcing our morality onto them. That is not what Jesus did. Jesus invites people. He told people, count the cost. Know what this is going to involve to follow me. In other words, Jesus actually discouraged people from following him. And the only way that makes sense to me is because he knows, first and foremost, he's going to offer them a life. He's going to offer them a path, and they are free to reject it if they wish. What that tells me is that it is not his mindset to then step into a culture and enact a bunch of laws that force people to only interpret him in one particular way and not recognize that there needs to be additional understanding and compassion all along the way. Laws can't do that. They never have been able to do that, which is precisely why God sends his word not as a law written on stones, but as a human being who now takes up residence in human hearts. This is the thrust of what the new covenant actually brings that the old covenant never could. And I can't believe at times how quickly Christians don't make the connection between the kingdom and how the law never could bring about what grace and what Jesus' presence could bring about. And yet when we stand for truth, quote unquote, as Christians, we think that the way to do that is to enact more laws. I'm not sure how people make that conclusion. I certainly don't, and I won't start anytime soon. But I do think it's helpful for us to think through, what is it that we are actually promoting? Are we promoting life and flourishing for everyone involved? Or are we promoting, well, we want the babies to be born, but whether those mothers can care for them after they're born, that's not my problem. That is most certainly not a real pro-life position. That would be, in fact, a pro-birth position. And as I've said, I'm not here to critique someone as being primarily pro-birth and not pro-life. That could be offensive unnecessarily, and that's not my goal. But when I listen to the way some of these discussions of affordable childcare and healthcare and teaching sex education and all of these things that are downplayed by conservative liberals, my question is, what kind of a world are you seeking to create where the brokenness that exists in the poverty and in the ignorance world and in the world where no resources are made available, how do you imagine forcing women to have babies in this world that's already broken will actually cause life and flourishing for that baby the moment it's born? Now, my wife and I were in foster care for 4 years, and we watched kids suffer tremendously as babies and as toddlers in homes where the mother wanted them. But because of drugs and poverty and boyfriends in and out of the houses, it was an unstable and unsafe environment for these kids. Deciding to impose a law that would require people to have babies who might not want them will create untold nightmares for thousands and thousands of babies when they come into this world. Because I've seen it firsthand of the trauma that kids experience from parents who wanted them. Now you're going to insert the reality that you might be requiring women to have babies who don't want them. If we're not prepared for the downward spiral that will create, then we're not actually thinking about life and flourishing for everyone. We might just be thinking about a law so that we can feel good about the stance that our country has decided to take on the abortion issue. But I would much rather us as Christians think about how we can encourage and create a life and flourishing type of a life for everyone involved. And that's going to take a whole lot more thought, consideration, and effort and time and money than it will just be to making abortion illegal. Rather, to go back, I'd rather us seek to find out what it might take to make it unnecessary. Giving people hope, giving people encouragement, embracing them, loving them, supporting them, giving them the choices, and trusting that we don't get to decide for other people the choices that they make. What we are here to do is to live by example and to embrace a world through wisdom and service who may make choices that we don't agree with, but we choose, as Jesus did, to stand with them in their brokenness, in their fallenness, asking God to work through those relationships in such a way that He brings hope out of tragedy and life and flourishing out of trauma and restored relationships out of broken relationships, and on and on and on. So that's all the time I'm going to take for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already left me a rating or a review and you would think about doing that this week, I would be super appreciative of that. And I know several of you, I imagine, are sharing these episodes with your friends. We've had quite a few people listen to the last week's episode, and that's encouraging for me. If you have questions or comments for me, feel free to reach out. I'm on Instagram at the Unbinding the Bible podcast. I'm also on Facebook under just Joshua Yoder, or you can email me at unbindingthebible@gmail.com. So thank you so much for tuning in this week. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week, and I will talk to you next time.